It began with a dusty camera. Elliot, a photographer in search of unique pieces for his collection, stumbled upon the camera in a forgotten antique shop. It was an old model, heavy and worn, with a roll of undeveloped film still inside. The owner said the camera hadn't been touched in decades. Something about the way it gleamed, almost calling to him, made Elliot buy it without question. Later that night, alone in his dim apartment, he carefully developed the film. The photos were typical at first: old black and white images of families standing in front of their homes, children playing in fields. But there was something wrong. Behind every subject, lurking just beyond the edges of the frame, were faint shapes, shadows. At first, they seemed like smudges, tricks of the light. But as Elliot squinted closer, his heart began to pound. The shapes weren't just shadows. They were figures, human figures, half-formed and blurred. No one in the photos appeared to notice them, not the smiling families, not the children playing. These figures had no faces, only hollow eyes that seemed to follow Elliot as he moved around the room. It felt like they were watching him through the photograph. A chill ran down his spine, but Elliot brushed it off. "It's just old film," he muttered, trying to convince himself. Yet that night, as he lay in bed, the image of those hollow eyes wouldn't leave him. In the darkness, he could swear he felt the cold presence of someone, or something, watching him. The next morning, driven by an insatiable curiosity, Elliot grabbed the old camera and began taking pictures. He aimed it at everyday objects in his apartment: the window, the empty chair, the hallway. The same creeping unease followed him as he clicked the shutter, each snap of the camera echoing in the silence of the room. When he developed the photos, dread twisted in his stomach. The same shadowy figures appeared, but this time, they were closer. Much closer. In one photo, a shadowed hand seemed to reach out from the hallway. In another, a figure loomed directly behind the chair, its head slightly turned, as if looking over the empty seat toward the camera. The worst photo was of the window. What had been a reflection of an empty street now showed a woman standing outside, her face contorted in agony. Her body was translucent, and yet, the terror in her expression was painfully clear. Elliot dropped the photograph, his hands shaking. He wasn't alone. The apartment, once a safe, familiar place, now felt oppressive, like the air itself was heavy with unseen eyes. He swore he could hear soft whispers, voices just out of reach, coming from the darkened corners of the room. Days passed, and Elliot became obsessed with the camera. He couldn't stop. He took photos everywhere, out on the street, in the park, even of strangers. And with each click, the figures in the photos became clearer, more defined. They were no longer distant shadows. They were faces, twisted, anguished, and screaming. Their mouths were open in silent wails, their arms outstretched, as if trying to claw their way out of the photograph. The people in the photos, the real people, began to change too. Their expressions, once neutral or happy, twisted into horror, as though they could see the spirits lurking behind them. And every time Elliot developed a new roll of film, the figures were closer to him, always closer. One night, Elliot made the mistake of taking a picture of himself in the mirror. When he developed the photo, his blood ran cold. The reflection wasn't his. It was him, his face, his clothes. But behind his reflection, pressing its face against the glass, was one of the spirits. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if ready to devour him whole. And it was smiling. That night, the whispering grew louder. He could no longer ignore the shadows that flitted across the corners of his vision. They were in the apartment now, moving through the walls, crawling on the ceiling, watching him from the corners of the room. Every time he blinked, they were closer. He could feel their cold breath on his neck, their fingers brushing against his skin. Elliot knew he had to destroy the camera. He couldn't bear the thought of taking another photo, of capturing another soul in that cursed device. But the thought of what might happen if he destroyed it terrified him even more. What would happen to the spirits trapped inside? Would they be released? Would they come for him? He hesitated, pacing the apartment, staring at the camera sitting on his desk like a ticking time bomb. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices urging him to take just one more photo. Just one more. But Elliot knew he couldn't. If he did, the next photograph would capture more than just shadows. He could feel the pull, the curse trying to ensnare him. He grabbed the camera and rushed outside, determined to end it once and for all. He smashed it against the ground, over and over, until the lens shattered and the film spilled out, tangled and ruined. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a bone-chilling scream echoed around him, so loud it seemed to rattle the very ground beneath his feet. The air grew cold, and the shadows around him thickened, swirling like a storm. He stumbled backward, watching in horror as the spirits he had captured began to rise from the broken camera, their twisted forms materializing before his eyes. They were free now, and they were angry. Elliot barely had time to run before the spirits descended on him. He could feel their cold fingers gripping his arms, their breath hot against his neck as they pulled him down. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the wind. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was his own face, reflected in the broken shards of the camera lens, twisted into the same hollow, screaming expression as the spirits he had freed. The photograph captured more than just souls, it holds them forever. Can you feel their eyes on you now? If you dare to see what's next, subscribe. The spirits are always watching, and they'll wait for you in the next story.